The moment people think you're nothing is the moment you see who they really are. The chandelier lights shimmered softly across the polished marble floor as Emily Carter moved between tables with quiet precision, her steps light, almost invisible, like she had mastered the art of not being noticed. And maybe she had, because in a place where dinners cost more than most people's weekly paychecks, no one really looked at the waitress unless they needed something. And even then, it was rarely her face they saw, just the uniform, the role, the assumption, and tonight was no different. Until it was, because at table 12 sat Richard Hayes, a name that carried weight in rooms far more powerful than this one, a man who didn't wait, didn't question, didn't tolerate mistakes, his watch catching the light every time he moved his wrist, a quiet reminder that his time was worth more than anyone else's. And when Emily approached, her voice calm, "Good evening, sir," he didn't look up right away, just slid something across the table with 2 fingers, slow, deliberate, a gesture that said he expected obedience without effort. And she noticed it instantly. Not the object, but the intention behind it, because people like him always revealed themselves in the smallest movements, and she had learned to read those long before she ever wore this uniform. "You were the last one here," he said finally, his tone smooth but edged like a blade hidden beneath velvet, and only then did he meet her eyes. Expecting hesitation, maybe fear, but what he found instead made him pause, just for a fraction of a second. Because Emily didn't react the way people usually did. Her hands steadied against the tray, her breathing even, her gaze clear, not challenging, not submissive, just present, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't immediately explain, the room around them continuing its low hum of quiet conversations and clinking glasses, unaware that something subtle had already shifted. "Sir?" she asked softly, giving him space to say what he clearly wanted to say. And that was when the tension tightened, invisible but real, like a string pulled just before it snaps, because whatever came next wouldn't just be about a missing item or a simple accusation. It would be about something deeper, something neither of them had planned. And as Richard leaned back slightly, studying her as if recalculating, Emily felt it too, that quiet turning point, the kind that doesn't announce itself but changes everything. And somewhere beyond the glass doors, headlights passed by in the night, unnoticed, as if the world outside already knew what the people inside had yet to understand. Richard did not answer immediately, and that silence began to stretch, thin and sharp, drawing attention from nearby tables as conversations softened and eyes started to drift toward table 12. Because something in the air had changed, and people could feel it even if they could not explain it. And he finally leaned forward, placing his hand flat on the table with controlled precision. The kind of movement that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. "A watch," he said, his voice low but carrying, "was here 5 minutes ago," and he tapped the empty space beside his glass. Once, twice, each tap measured, deliberate, and now it is not. Emily followed the gesture with her eyes, calm, unhurried, taking in the details without rushing to defend herself. Because rushing meant panic, and panic meant guilt in rooms like this, and she had learned that long ago. "I understand," she replied, her tone even, almost gentle, but not apologetic, never apologetic without reason. And that subtle difference made his jaw tighten, because he was expecting something else, something easier to dismiss. "You were the last person at this table," he continued, his gaze locking onto hers, searching for cracks, hesitation, anything he could use to confirm what he had already decided. But she did not look away, did not shift, did not shrink, and that only made the tension grow heavier, pressing down on the space between them. "Then I'm the last person who can help you find it," she said quietly, and for a brief moment, that answer disarmed him, not because it was clever, but because it refused to fit into the role he had already assigned her. And behind him, one of the guests shifted in his seat, uncomfortable, sensing that this was no longer just about a missing item. "This is not a game," Richard said, his voice sharpening slightly, the edge now visible. "That watch is worth more than most people make in a year." And there was the line that revealed everything, not about the watch, but about how he measured value. And Emily heard it, understood it, but did not react to it. Because to react would be to accept the premise, and she did not. Then it should be easy to track. she replied, her eyes briefly flicking toward the security cameras positioned high in the corners of the room, small, discreet, but always watching. You have cameras, she added, not as a suggestion, but as a quiet fact. And now the manager was approaching, drawn by the shift in tone, his smile strained, his posture tight, already calculating how to resolve the situation without upsetting the man who brought in more revenue in one night than most customers did in a month. Is there a problem? Here, Mr. Hayes, he asked, though his eyes had already moved to Emily, as if expecting the answer to be her fault. And Richard did not look at him, did not need to. Yes, he said, still watching her, there is. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Because sometimes it is not the accusation that changes everything. It is the way someone chooses to respond to it. And Emily Carter was not responding the way anyone expected. The manager's smile faltered just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. His eyes flicking between Richard Hayes and Emily, as if trying to solve a problem that had already grown beyond his control. Emily, he said quietly, but with a firmness that carried expectation, step aside for a moment. And that was the moment most people would comply. Step back, lower their gaze, let someone else take over. But she did not move, not out of defiance, not out of pride, simply because she had no reason to. And that stillness spoke louder than any argument could have, causing a ripple of unease to spread through the small circle forming around them. I can assist here, she replied calmly, her voice steady. And the choice of words mattered. Not defend, not explain, assist, as if the situation itself deserved clarity rather than accusation. And Richard noticed it, the control in her tone, the absence of fear, and it irritated him more than if she had protested, because he was used to reactions, to people revealing themselves under pressure. But she remained composed, unreadable. There is nothing to assist with, he said, his patience thinning. The situation is obvious, and that word hung in the air. Obvious, as if the conclusion had already been written before the conversation even began, and Emily let a brief silence pass before she answered, not rushing, not filling the space unnecessarily. Then let us make it clear, she said, and again, the choice of words shifted the dynamic, from accusation to process, from emotion to logic, and the manager exhaled softly, sensing that control was slipping from his hands. We can review the footage, he offered quickly, eager to resolve the situation, but Richard did not look at him, his focus still fixed on Emily, as if the answer he wanted was not in the cameras, but in her reaction, or Emily added gently, her eyes moving once more toward the table, scanning, observing. We can check something first. And without waiting for permission, she reached for the folded napkin resting near the edge of the table, lifting it carefully, slowly enough that every movement could be seen, every second stretching just a little longer than necessary, and beneath it, there was nothing, just polished wood reflecting the soft light above, and she set it back down with the same care, not rushing, not performing, simply completing the motion. And for a moment, it seemed like nothing had changed, like the answer was still missing, and that uncertainty made the tension tighten again. You are wasting time, Richard said, though his voice carried a trace of something new now. Not doubt exactly, but a shift, a small fracture in the certainty he had held just moments ago. And Emily nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the concern. Then we should not waste any more, she replied, and her gaze moved, not randomly, but deliberately, tracing the edge of the table, the chair, the floor beside it, details most people would overlook because they were too focused on the accusation itself. And then she paused just for a second, her eyes settling on something near the base of the chair leg, something small, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. And she crouched slightly, not hurried, not dramatic, just enough to reach down and pick it up. And when she stood again, her hand opened slowly, revealing the watch, its polished surface, catching the light as if it had been there all along, unnoticed, and the room seemed to exhale in unison, the tension breaking, not with noise, but with silence, the kind that follows a realization. And Emily placed the watch gently on the table, exactly where it had been before, her voice quiet, almost kind. It slipped, she said, not accusing, not correcting, just stating a simple truth. And for the first time since the moment began, Richard Hayes did not speak, because sometimes the loudest moment in a room is when the person with all the power suddenly has nothing to say. For a moment, no one moved, not even the manager, not even the guests who had been quietly watching from a distance, because the truth had just settled in the middle of the table, simple and undeniable, and it did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And Richard Hayes stared at the watch as if it had betrayed him, as if its quiet presence now carried more weight than the accusation he had made just seconds before. His fingers hovering slightly above the table before finally reaching out to pick it up, slower this time, more deliberate, as though he were recalibrating something inside himself that had shifted without warning. It must have. He began, but the sentence did not finish because there was no version of it that could restore what had already been said, and Emily did not interrupt, did not fill the silence for him. She simply stepped back half an inch, giving space, not retreating, just allowing the moment to exist as it was, and that choice, that restraint, made the room feel even quieter. "I believe everything is accounted for now," she said gently, her tone unchanged, as if the tension that had just passed through the room had never touched her. And the manager exhaled, relief washing over his face, eager to close the situation, to smooth it over, to return everything to normal as quickly as possible. "Yes, of course. Thank you, Emily," he added quickly, his voice slightly too bright, already shifting his attention back to Richard. "Mr. Hayes, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." But Richard did not acknowledge him right away, his gaze still fixed on Emily, studying her in a way that was different now. Not dismissive, not commanding, but searching, as if you're trying to understand something that did not fit into his usual framework. And for the first time, there was hesitation, not in his posture, but in his certainty, and that was something far more difficult to conceal. "You noticed it immediately," he said after a moment, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier edge, and Emily gave a small nod, not proud, not defensive, simply acknowledging the observation. "It was not hidden," she replied, and again, the simplicity of her words carried more weight than anything else she could have said, because she was not claiming skill, not drawing attention to herself. She was pointing to something that had always been there, waiting to be seen, and that realization settled between them, heavier than the accusation ever had, and Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to be noticeable, his grip on control loosening in a way he was not used to. "Most people would not have looked there," he said almost to himself, and Emily's gaze softened just a fraction. "Most people are looking for the wrong thing," she answered, and that line, quiet and precise, landed deeper than either of them expected, because it was not just about the watch, not really, and the room around them slowly began to return to its rhythm. Conversations picking up again, glasses clinking softly, as if the moment had passed. But something remained, something unspoken, lingering in the space between them, and as Emily turned slightly to resume her work, her hand brushed lightly against the pendant, resting at her collarbone, the small engraved letters catching the light for just a second before disappearing again, unnoticed by most, but not by Richard, who had already begun to realize that this situation, this woman, was not as simple as it had first appeared, and somewhere deep beneath the surface of his composure, a question had begun to form, one he could not yet answer, but could no longer ignore. The rhythm of the restaurant slowly returned, but something invisible had shifted, something that did not belong to the clinking glasses or the soft conversations, and Richard Hayes could feel it, sitting there with the watch now resting against his wrist again, heavier than before, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, and his eyes followed Emily Carter as she moved away from the table, her steps as steady as they had been before, her posture unchanged, as if the moment that had just unfolded had not left a mark on her at all, and that unsettled him more than the mistake itself, because he was used to impact, used to seeing reactions, consequences, ripples, but she had absorbed it and continued, like water closing over a stone, leaving no trace behind, and that made him lean forward slightly, his attention no longer divided, no longer distracted, focused entirely on understanding something he had clearly misjudged. "Emily," he called out, not loudly, but enough to stop her, and she paused, turning back with the same composed expression, not eager, not hesitant, simply present. "Yes, sir," she replied, and again, there was no edge in her voice, no lingering tension, just professionalism carried with quiet dignity. And Richard hesitated, just for a second, choosing his next words more carefully than he had before, because for the first time, he understood that words mattered here, that assumptions had consequences he could not easily erase. "You handled that efficiently," he said, the compliment sounding unfamiliar even to his own ears, as if he were testing a language he did not often use. And Emily gave a small nod, acknowledging it without absorbing it. "It was a simple situation," she answered, and the simplicity of her response made the gap between them more visible, because what had been simple for her had clearly not been simple for him. And that realization settled in quietly, pressing against his usual sense of control. "Not everyone would have stayed calm," he added, almost probing now, searching for something beneath the surface, and Emily's gaze held his for a moment longer than before, not challenging, but not avoiding either. "Calm helps you see what is already there," she said, and again, her words carried that same quiet precision, like she was not just answering him, but revealing a pattern he had never learned to notice. And Richard leaned back slightly, absorbing it, the pieces beginning to connect in a way that made him uncomfortable, because it suggested that the problem had never been the situation, it had been his perspective, and that was not something he was used to questioning. "You have done this before," he said, more statement than question, and Emily's expression did not change. But something in her eyes shifted, just slightly, a flicker of something deeper, something that hinted at a story not being told. "I have learned to pay attention," she replied, choosing her words carefully, offering just enough to answer without revealing more than she intended. And that restraint made Richard more curious, not less, because it suggested depth, layers, something beyond the role she was playing in this room. And as she turned to leave again, his gaze dropped briefly, catching the glint of the pendant at her collarbone, the engraved letters just visible for a fraction of a second. J and C. Simple, understated, but deliberate, and something about it stayed with him, lingering in his thoughts as she disappeared into the flow of the restaurant once more. And for the first time that evening, Richard Hayes realized that the most important detail in the room had never been the watch. It had been the person he almost failed to see. The night moved forward, but Richard Hayes no longer experienced it the same way, because once a certainty cracks, even slightly, everything begins to feel different, and he found himself watching the room with a new kind of attention, not the usual, scanning for status or influence, but something quieter, something closer to observation, the way Emily had done, and it was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, as if he had stepped into a perspective that did not belong to him. And yet he could not step back out of it, not after what had just happened. And across the room, Emily continued her work, seamless, efficient, moving from table to table with the same calm presence, her voice low, her gestures precise, nothing wasted, nothing exaggerated. And the more he watched, the more he noticed things he had missed before, the way she anticipated a guest's request before it was spoken, the way she adjusted the smallest details without drawing attention, the way people seemed to relax without realizing why, as if her presence quietly aligned the space around her, and it made him question something he had never questioned before. How many times had he overlooked this? Not just here, but everywhere. How many times had he dismissed something valuable simply because it did not present itself loudly? And the thought lingered, unsettling but persistent, until it was interrupted by a subtle shift at the entrance, a movement that did not match the rhythm of the restaurant, and a few heads turned, just briefly, not out of curiosity, but recognition, because the presence entering the room carried a different kind of weight, one that did not need to announce itself. And Richard noticed it too, the way the manager straightened instinctively, the way a server paused mid-step, not out of fear, but respect, and his gaze followed theirs, drawn toward the door where a man stepped inside, composed, measured, dressed simply, but with an unmistakable authority that did not rely on display. And there was no rush in his movement, no need for attention, yet the room adjusted around him as if it understood something without being told. And for a brief moment, Richard felt a flicker of recognition, not of the man himself, but of the reaction he inspired, because it was different from his own, quieter, steadier, more controlled, and it made him sit up slightly, his curiosity sharpening, while across the room, Emily had stopped, just for a second, her posture shifting in a way so subtle most would not notice, but Richard did, because now he was looking, really looking, and something in her expression changed, not visibly, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to signal that this moment mattered. And she turned toward the entrance, her steps no longer just part of her routine, but purposeful, intentional, as if she were moving toward something she had been expecting, and Richard's gaze followed her again, connecting. The movement, the man, the shift in the room, pieces that did not yet form a complete picture, but were beginning to align, and for the first time that evening, he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel, uncertainty, not about a deal, not about a decision, but about a person. And as Emily approached the man who had just entered, stopping just a few feet away, her voice soft but clear, carrying only to him, Richard leaned forward slightly, not to intrude, but because something told him that whatever happened next would change more than just the outcome of a simple misunderstanding. Emily stopped just in front of him, close enough that their voices did not need to rise, yet far enough to keep the moment contained, private in a room full of people. And for the first time since he had entered, the man's expression softened, not into a smile, but into recognition, the kind that carried history, and Emily lowered her gaze slightly, not out of submission, but respect, a quiet acknowledgement that spoke more clearly than any introduction could have. "You came," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been there before. And the man nodded once, his eyes scanning her face with a calm intensity, as if measuring not what had happened, but how she had handled it. "You sounded certain," he replied, his tone low, composed, every word deliberate, and behind them, the manager had already begun moving forward, his posture shifting again, this time more formal, more cautious, because now he understood that this was no ordinary guest, not by the way the room adjusted, not by the way even the most confident diners chose to remain silent. And Richard Hayes watched it all, the exchange, the subtle shifts, the invisible lines of power rearranging themselves in real time. And something inside him tightened, not fear but realization, because he had seen this before in boardrooms, in negotiations, in moments when control changed hands without a single raised voice. And now it was happening here, in a place he thought he understood, and he was no longer certain where he stood within it. And Emily turned slightly, just enough to bring him into the edge of the moment, her presence still calm, still grounded, but no longer confined to the role he had assigned her. And the man's gaze followed, landing on Richard with a quiet focus that did not need introduction, because recognition moved faster than words. And for a brief second, Richard felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not intimidation, but the awareness that he was being seen, fully, clearly, without the usual filters of status or assumption. And it made him straighten unconsciously, adjusting his posture as if responding to a standard he had not been aware of before. "There was a misunderstanding," Richard said, his voice controlled, but lacking the certainty it had carried earlier, and the man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his silence somehow more demanding than any question could have been. And Emily did not speak, did not defend, did not explain. She simply stood there, allowing the moment to unfold, because whatever needed to be understood would not come from her words. And after a pause that felt longer than it was, the man gave a small nod, not in agreement, but an acknowledgement. "I see," he said, and those two words carried more weight than any judgment, because they did not resolve the situation, they reframed it, shifting the focus from what had happened to how it had been handled. And the room seemed to lean in without moving, drawn into the quiet gravity of the exchange. And Richard realized then that this was no longer about a misplaced watch or a moment of poor judgment. It was about something far more difficult to recover, something that could not be corrected with an apology or a gesture. And as Emily's hand rested lightly near the pendant at her collarbone, the engraved letters catching the light once more, the connection that had been forming in his mind began to take shape, incomplete, but undeniable. And for the first time that night, Richard Hayes understood that the situation he thought he controlled had already moved beyond him. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the table like something deliberate, something chosen, and the man standing beside Emily finally shifted his attention fully to Richard Hayes, not with aggression, not with judgment, but with a clarity that made everything else in the room feel distant, almost irrelevant. A misunderstanding, he repeated, his voice calm, steady, but carrying an authority that did not need to rise to be heard. And Richard nodded once, slower this time, aware. Now that every word mattered, that this was no longer a situation he could control with confidence alone. Yes, he said, choosing each word carefully, one that has been resolved. And the man studied him for a brief moment, not searching for an answer, but measuring the space between what was said and what was meant. And Emily remained still, her presence quiet but central, not leading the moment, not withdrawing from it, simply allowing it to unfold without interference, because she understood something Richard was only beginning to realize, that truth does not need to defend itself. And after a pause, the man gave a slight nod, acknowledging the words without confirming them. Resolution is not always the same as understanding, he said, and the sentence landed softly, but it shifted the ground beneath the conversation because it reframed everything that had just happened, not as a mistake corrected, but as something revealed, and Richard felt it, that shift, subtle but undeniable, pressing against the certainty he had carried into the evening. And for the first time, he did not respond immediately because there was nothing simple left to say, and the manager stepped closer, his posture now almost formal. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice respectful, careful, and that single name moved through the space like a quiet signal, confirming what had only been implied until now. And Richard's gaze flickered, just briefly, from the man to Emily, and then to the pendant resting at her collarbone, the engraved initials no longer just a detail, but a connection, one that closed the distance between assumption and reality in an instant, and something inside him settled. Not relief, not acceptance, but recognition, the kind that arrives too late to change what has already been done. And Emily's hand moved lightly against the pendant, almost unconsciously, as if grounding herself in the moment. And when she spoke, her voice remained the same, calm, measured, but now there was something else beneath it, something quieter, something personal. "I told you it was simple," she said, not to correct him, not to prove anything, but to complete the thought she had offered earlier. And Richard met her gaze again, fully this time, without the distance he had kept before, and in that moment he saw what he had missed, not just her composure, not just her intelligence, but her choice, the decision to stand in that space without using what she could have revealed from the beginning. And that realization carried more weight than any title ever could, and the man beside her, Jonathan Carter, turned slightly, his attention now encompassing both of them, not as opposing sides, but as participants in something larger than the moment itself. "What matters," he said quietly, "is not what was misplaced." And his eyes rested on Richard for a brief second before continuing. "But what was assumed," and there was no accusation in his tone, no anger, just a simple statement that held a mirror to the situation, and Richard felt it, the clarity of it, cutting through the layers of justification he might have used before, leaving only what was real. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, the weight of the moment did not disappear, it settled, lingering in the space between them, not as conflict, but as understanding, the kind that cannot be undone once it has been seen. The moment did not end with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It ended with something far quieter, something far more lasting. And Richard Hayes remained seated, his posture still composed, but no longer anchored in the certainty he had carried into the room, because that certainty had been replaced by something heavier, something harder to ignore. And as Jonathan Carter stepped back slightly, giving space not out of retreat, but out of completion, the focus shifted once more, not outward, but inward, toward what each person would carry from this moment. And Emily stood between them for a second longer, her presence calm, unchanged, as if nothing about her had needed to rise to meet the situation, because she had never lowered herself to it in the first place. And then, without announcement, without seeking attention, she turned and resumed her work, her steps steady, her movements precise, returning to the rhythm of the restaurant, as if this had only been a brief interruption. And that choice, that quiet return, left a deeper impression than anything she could have said, because it showed that her identity had never depended on what others assumed. And Richard watched her go, not with curiosity now, but with understanding, the kind that arrives slowly and settles deeply. And for the first time, he saw the full shape of the moment, not as an isolated mistake, but as a reflection, a clear and unfiltered view of how easily power could distort perception, and how quickly assumption can replace truth when it is left unchecked. And he reached for his watch again, not to check the time, but to feel its weight, to remind himself of how something so small had revealed something so significant. And his fingers paused for a moment before resting against the table instead, as if even that familiar gesture now carried a different meaning. And across the room, Emily paused briefly to assist another guest, her voice soft, her presence steady, no trace of the moment visible in her expression, because she had already moved beyond it, not by forgetting, but by refusing to let it define her. And Jonathan Carter observed quietly for a final second, his gaze resting on Richard, not with judgment, but with a calm acknowledgement, as if to say that what needed to be seen had already been seen, and there was nothing more to add. And then he turned, his departure as understated as his arrival, leaving behind a space that felt subtly different, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been understood. And as the evening continued, the restaurant returned fully to its rhythm, conversations rising, glasses clinking, life moving forward as it always does. But for Richard Hayes, something had shifted in a way that would not return to its previous state. Because once you learn to see what you once overlooked, you cannot unsee it. And he remained there for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, understanding that the most important thing he had gained that night was not something he could measure, not something he could own, but something far more valuable, perspective. And as he finally stood, adjusting his jacket with a movement that felt slightly more deliberate than before, his gaze drifted once more toward Emily, not to call her back, not to speak, but simply to acknowledge, silently, the standard she had set without ever raising her voice. And somewhere within that quiet acknowledgement, a new understanding took root, one that would follow him long after the lights dimmed and the doors closed, because in the end, it was never about who held the power, it was about who understood how to use it.